Okay, let's jump right into this explainer. Today, we're looking at a pretty fascinating and honestly intense dynamic. What actually happens when a massive conventional military force gets thrust into a completely unconventional, highly constrained combat environment? We're diving into some primary source documents detailing a major historical deployment, the Indian Peacekeeping Force, or IPKF, in Sri Lanka. It's essentially a masterclass in the friction of war and really highlights why adaptation is absolutely crucial to survival. To set the stage, we first need to look at the massive friction created when you force a conventional military machine to operate in an urban insurgency. Now, conventional forces are built for open terrain. They rely on massive formations and standard, predictable logistical lines. But when they hit the ground in Sri Lanka, they were suddenly facing dense urban environments, totally unpredictable guerrilla tactics, and really severe operational constraints. I mean, it was a total shock to the system. The playbook they brought with them simply didn't match the reality they were facing. And that brings us to the core question driving our whole analysis today. When your doctrine completely clashes with the terrain, how does military capability actually adapt so you can survive and succeed? Because, let's be real, having a powerful military on paper means literally nothing if it can't adjust to the actual environment it has to fight in. So, to figure that out, we're going to break the whole military apparatus down into 6 operational domains. We'll look at the unconventional environment, the infantry challenge, adapting the combat arms, the information battle, logistics and supply chains, and wrap it up with joint ops and effectiveness. All right, moving into our first section, the unconventional environment, and that initial shock to the system. You kind of have to think of a military force like a giant capability wheel. It's made up of distinct, interlocking branches. You've got your infantry, armor, artillery, stretching all the way around to logistics and air support. No single branch works in a vacuum. So when this entire wheel was just dropped into the Sri Lankan theater, every single component faced its own unique set of problems. They all had to drastically change how they functioned just to keep the wheel turning. Let's move on to Section 2, the infantry challenge, where the friction on the ground was really felt the hardest. The sheer volume of constraints the infantry faced right out of the gate is honestly staggering. Imagine deploying, and right away, your battalion is only at 50% strength because of mobilization delays. You have almost no supporting fire because you're desperately trying to avoid civilian casualties. You're dealing with severe shortages of basic maps and intelligence. And to top it all off, your adversary, the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam, or LTTE insurgents, they're rocking superior automatic weapons like AK-47s, while your troops are stuck lugging around heavier, slower-firing rifles in dense, heavily booby-trapped urban streets. Just a total nightmare scenario. Now, the initial human reaction to all that chaos is to bunch up. The infantry sought security in numbers, naturally, moving in these large formations down single streets. But that just made them massive, easy targets. They had to adapt, and they did. They evolved to deploying small, highly agile patrols spread out over broad fronts. By breaking into these smaller teams, they could actually bait the opposition, flank them if a neighboring unit took fire, and finally start dominating the area instead of just trying to survive it. This brings us to Section 3, adapting the combat arms and redefining doctrine on the fly. Let's start by looking at the Special Forces. You'd think they'd have it figured out, right? But initially, they really struggled. They were fighting just like regular infantry, moving in big groups, dragged down by a heavy administrative tail, and completely failing to achieve tactical surprise. But they recognized the problem and adapted fast. Once they ditched that heavy tail, miniaturized their gear, and started operating in small, high-speed groups relying on deception, they started getting spectacular results. They basically had to relearn how to be special forces for this specific jungle and urban mix. And for the armor and mechanized forces, wow, this was a classic clash of doctrine versus reality. The doctrine screamed for mass tank formations rolling over wide open ground. The reality? Lagoons and claustrophobic urban streets. They took heavy losses at first because they literally couldn't maneuver. So they completely changed their approach. They dropped the mass formations and started deploying tanks in what they called penny packets. Just a handful of tanks used strictly for direct fire in built-up areas. And the biggest lesson? The infantry had to move in first to secure the flanks and protect those tanks from handheld rockets. Meanwhile, the engineers turned into the ultimate unsung heroes of the operation. Their to-do list was just insane. They were out there doing the unbelievably dangerous work of clearing complex minefields and IEDs under direct fire. But on top of that, they basically kept the logistical lifeline alive by themselves. They were extending and improvising vital airfields at Pali and Bavunia, At one point, they even had to step in and operate the KKS port jetty just to get ships unloaded. And if that wasn't enough, they were also out there repairing civilian infrastructure like hospitals and power grids. Okay, let's pivot to Section 4, the information battle. Winning this signals battle was like solving a massive puzzle, and it required a very precise three-step flow. See, the LTTE had this incredibly efficient communication network running on Japanese citizens band radios, mostly in the 148 to 150 megahertz range. To counter that, the IPKF first had to establish rock-solid command, control, and intelligence nodes, or C3I nodes, at places like Palieli and Trincomalee. Then step 2, they took captured adversary radios, locked onto preset frequencies, and started intercepting and jamming enemy signals. The real genius, though, was step 3, analyzing the pure volume of that radio traffic to pinpoint exactly where the hostile leadership was hiding. But of course, they hit a major technical wall here too. The standard VHF radios they brought with them, they just completely failed in the dense concrete environments. It's a phenomenon called the screening effect. It's wild to think about, but urban terrain literally blocks invisible infrastructure like radio waves. They had to frantically adapt and shift to older HF sets just to be able to talk to each other across a couple of city blocks. Which brings us to Section 5, because absolutely none of this matters without logistics and supply chains. Let's trace the logistics route because it was a monumental headache. Everything had to originate from the main hub over in Madras, India. From there, it had to cross a contested sea obstacle using completely overstretched naval and air assets, before finally reaching forward areas like Palali, Trincomalee, and KKS. And forward area is a generous term here. Trincomalee was literally just a private flour mill jetty that they could only use intermittently, and the jetty at KKS was completely broken down when they first arrived. And to put the sheer strain into perspective, just look at this number. The main supply depot in Madras was designed to handle 10,000 troops. Suddenly, it's trying to sustain over 30,000, and that number is steadily climbing. They couldn't buy food locally without spiking prices and turning the civilian population against them, and political constraints meant they couldn't sign long-term supply contracts. So they're surviving on wildly expensive short-term contracts. There were times they were so desperate for fuel that massive IL-76 transport planes would land, drop off their cargo, and then literally siphon off their own surplus aviation fuel just to keep the forward bases running. I mean, talk about improvising on the fly. Finally, we're at Section 6, Joint Ops and Effectiveness. Let's pull all these threads together. Getting the different military branches to work together, joint operations, had massive friction early on. The Army was having to cram troops onto the open decks of really primitive naval transport craft. They were dealing with a severe, crippling lack of heavy-lift Mi-8 helicopters, which basically paused all essential heli-borne operations for the first month. And even when they got tactical aerial photography from jets like Jaguars, the lag time before those photo mosaics actually reached the commanders on the ground was so long, they were practically useless. The branches really had to learn how to integrate seamlessly while under immense active pressure. So, boiling all these operational realities down, we get this core formula. Having the right capability, the troops, the tanks, the fancy radios, it means nothing without the right employment. You simply cannot use an open desert tank doctrine in a cramped, booby-trapped urban environment. The bridge between having a capability and employing it correctly is adaptation. Your absolute willingness to change your tactics, hack your gear, and rewrite the rulebook while under extreme constraints, that is what actually equals effectiveness on the battlefield. As we wrap up this explainer, here's what I want to leave you with. We've just walked through the incredible friction in these source documents. We've seen how every single gear in this massive military machine groaned, and sometimes broke, before it was finally forced to adapt. Looking at how rapidly warfare is shifting today, do you think modern conventional forces have truly internalized these lessons? Are they actually prepared to adapt when the next urban crucible flares up? Or are we just doomed to learn these exact same painful lessons all over again? Think about it. Thanks so much for joining me on this deep dive, and I'll catch you in the next one.